Welcome to the Building Texas Show, where we find the leaders behind the businesses and organizations driving progress in Texas. In each episode, we share the stories of innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders committed to evolving Texas into its next era. I'm your host, Justin McKenzie, your guide to help you think about how to engage in the movement and support building Texas across the entire state. Welcome to this week's episode of the Building Texas Show. I'm thrilled to have a conversation today about the history and heritage of Texas in a lot of ways, and then the impact of how do we support that heritage, capture the stories, but then move into the modern world and take some old buildings, older homes that have historic value and make them part of our fabric and how we tell the story of building Texas. What I enjoy and really appreciate about some of these buildings is they've been critical in San Antonio, to the commerce side of San Antonio. A lot of the historic district of downtown was created when we were first doing commerce and first bringing people from outside of our indigenous populations into San Antonio. And that's where commerce started here in Central Texas. San Antonio is very responsible for that. But then we look at towns like Bernie and Bandera. So I'm thrilled to have Wood Chipman here with us today, and from Guy Chipman Construction. And you focus on historic homes, historic buildings that could be commercial property, residential properties, courthouses, all of those type of buildings. And I'm excited to jump into that and talk about how that is preserving Texas, but it's also building a bright future. So Wood, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. We've been blessed to have a lot of projects that date back many, many years in history, and we kind of specialize on caring for these old buildings, and there are challenges that go along with restoring an old building.
So Guy Chipman Construction, the Guy Chipman name has a long history in San Antonio, but how did you find yourself in the role and operating this company and taking care of these homes?
Well, my dad was a realtor in San Antonio for over 60 years. He had Guy Chipman Company Realtors and had 10 offices spread all over the hill country in San Antonio, and was influential in the real estate industry itself. He helped write the contracts, the earnest money contracts, and the legal net framework that is used today for real estate transactions. And he started the company in late 1940s with my grandmother out of the house I live in today. So my dad's company, I didn't really want to be a realtor. I wanted to be an architect. And I started in construction when I was 15, doing everything from a demolition to a mason's helper to carpentry. And I learned a lot in those times. And I always wanted to be an architect. And so I took architecture classes in high school, or drafting classes in high school. And then I ended up getting my degree in architecture from UT Arlington. Back to my dad's company, it was sold to Coldwell Banker, Deanne Harper Realtors in around 2001. And my dad had done a great job of marketing, and everybody knew his company. And I said, I want to carry on this name in a new company. And I started Guy Chipman Construction in 2002. And we've been doing it ever since.
Well, I appreciate that in high school, you were able to say, I want to be an architect, and you got into drafting. I do a lot of work with high school kids in the CTE program, Career Technology and Education. And I'm seeing that drafting really come back as CAD now. So everything's automated. But the drafting tables of the past and how we look at these old blueprints of these buildings, it's fascinating to a person like me that really wants to dig in and say, well, why did they do it this way? And is that what it would look like today if we built it?
It's always a lot of forensics when you're dealing with an old building, and you have to go, what was this guy thinking? Oh, look, this really worked. This preserved this building. This has lasted for the test of time. Maybe it's lead, sheet lead, which is probably not something we'd use today because of its toxicity. but it held up. And, there's still some buildings that are using lead, like Notre Dame Cathedral.
Yeah.
They use lead to cover all of those spires that are up on the top of the roof.
Well, to that end, like it's an investment to take on one of these buildings, whether it's a commercial building in a downtown district or in Bernie, historic buildings up and down Main Street, or it's a historic home. What what are the responsibilities? What's the cost of really taking on one of those projects?
Well, to take on a historic preservation project, you've got to have a lot of patience. You got to have a lot of tenacity, and you're gonna have to spend a little bit of money to do it as well. A lot of people will say, "Oh, this building has such good bones," but after having to do a hip replacement surgery on a house or replace major beams and things that are part of those bones, that those costs can be incurred during the restoration of a building. And so, uh, many times owners have a hard time finding contractors who are qualified to do work on old houses. There's 1,000 painters out there, but there's very few painters who can do a putty glazed window restoration, and it's a specialty in an art that a lot of people that don't know or have lost track of in today's construction market.
A historic home is typically documented with the state, right? It is a historic property recognized by city, state, some form of entity. Am I understanding that
There's several different historical designations that are possible. You can be in a historic district.
Okay.
Your home could have some kind of historic history, like, Henry B. Gonzalez's mother lived there or something like that. There's also landmarks, which are, special properties that are set aside as a state landmark, and uh, that's registered with the Texas Historic Commission. There's good and bad about being a landmark, because you wouldn't be able to replace your windows with new windows on a landmark unless they were approved by the Texas Historic Commission and that's a rigorous process that you have to go through. The historic buildings, the exterior is controlled by the historic preservation guidelines, but you're free to do what you want on the interior of a house as long as it's not changing the windows. So that gives people a little more leeway to do what they need to on a house, but it gives the guideline to preserve the outward appearance of the house historically and with materials that are consistent with the historic guidelines.
How do homeowners that have bought a house, they've closed, they're in it, and they need to do a repair, they need to replace the windows, they want to. How do they find out that these rules are in place and that do they know that before they buy the home, hopefully?
Well, yeah, that not all the time, and
Yeah.
realtors don't always tell them that. And in San Antonio, the Office of Historic Preservation can be a bit punitive if you go out and replace your windows with something modern that doesn't meet the guidelines, and you can be forced to restore the original windows that were there and throw away your brand new windows that you've got, and they can fine you, and there's all kind of other things that go on like that. So, um, it's tough, and in those historic districts, there's a certain street sign that says it's a historic district, and then other parts of San Antonio, one block over, are not historic. So you almost have to go, what's the street sign on my street?
Yeah.
Is it a historic district before you go out and start replacing windows and stuff like that?
When we look at historic districts and preservation societies, they do wonderful work and their intention is to hold to the heritage. But that looks different. And I just think of some historic communities, San Antonio, Corpus, Bandera, Bernie, Blanco. They all have this opportunity and they're using historic preservation in some level. What is it different going from a big city preservation community, San Antonio, to small town Bernie?
Definitely. San Antonio has a rigorous program where they're educating and they're holding workshops and they're providing tools for the homeowners. They have the historic homeowners fair, which is a meeting of preservation contractors and businesses, and people can find somebody to restore their windows, and that's something that, or do their floors or what have you, their foundation. But I don't know that those opportunities exist in the smaller towns. It's they have a robust historic preservation department that is active in many ways, and encouraging volunteers to go out and fix up neighborhoods is one of the great things that they've done. They'll pick a side of town and say, okay, we're going to restore these 2 blocks, and within a few years, you see the whole neighborhood uh, blossoming after the restoration of a few houses within it. So I think that's great. I don't know how much in per se New Braunfels or other historic cities have those opportunities.
It is the balance, right? Because if I think about our community that we're sitting in, a lot of our retailers on Main Street, just because of the geography, are in historic buildings. And that's covered and protected by our HLC here in town, the Historic Commission. But there's always a balance of we need to modernize these buildings, these homes. And that's an significant expense when you say, well, we're going to put air conditioning in a 120-year-old building that never had air conditioning before. I've seen where that's not always possible because you can't get permission to do that. But then I think about the modern needs of censoring, internet, Wi-Fi, AV if you're in a bar, brewery facility. How do you balance the needs of modern economic need to finding that we're saving history, we're saving the historic legacy? It seems I've seen it conflict at times.
Mm-hmm. There's actually some preservation tax credits available to people for commercial buildings, especially, that can help with the cost of restoring the infrastructure of the building, the electrical, the mechanical, the plumbing systems, the structural, the roof. Those things all qualify for these tax credits. And I think there's a 25% tax credit from the state that's available for both for residential and commercial buildings. But then on the federal level, there's another 20% that's available for commercial buildings as an income tax credit. And that can be, that's 45% of the cost of AC replacement, electrical rewiring, plumbing, and these major components of the building. And that can really add up and help people save some money. As far as modernizing, there's some challenges with the older buildings. A lot of times there was lead paint on the walls or metal lath in the plaster and things that block Wi-Fi signals. So you need to have a little bit more repeaters and stuff like that to get a good signal throughout the building. But it is possible through the use of mini splits and other type of air conditioning equipment to tastefully install air conditioning in a historic home. And I'll use the Her Farm, for example. They could put on the second floor, they could put the system up in the attic and it didn't show. But on the first floor, it had 2-foot thick rock walls. And so what we ended up doing was getting some floor mounted mini split units and then building a little cabinet around them with reclaimed wood from the house that just blended in so well that you wouldn't really notice that there was air conditioning there. And, it's important to bring the wiring up to code and all that stuff because it can do damage to the building. And you want to make sure your plumbing's not leaking in your building. You want to make sure your electrical is safe and there's no trees that are going to collapse on your building. And, you look at the things that can shorten the lifespan of the building and you address those first in a kind of a triage method.
Well, and I appreciate what you're saying because we were in Comfort recently and we were looking at the Ingenhut on High. And as a reminder, if you haven't seen that episode, it was built by Alfred Giles. So it has an important architectural history for the region, but it was an electrical fire ultimately that burned down that building. And someone came back and restored it later, 5 years later. But I think it is that balance of someone like you, an architect in a construction mind that says, hey, I've seen this before. I recognize that paint. I've walked through buildings with you and you can see some very interesting details that I, as a layperson, would never know the difference. But to you, it's glaring. How does a homeowner find the right partner on a historic preservation? Because it does seem Somebody that's building new residential homes is probably not the person you'd ask for advice.
Exactly. There's a couple of different, again, San Antonio and their Office of Historic Preservation has a list of contractors that you can, n- contact to work on different portions of the building. There's a list called Scott's List, I think. Scott was out of King William, and he just started building a list of people that his friends trusted and his neighbors trusted, and it's kind of like an Angie's List of historic people in San Antonio. So there's a couple of different alternatives out there to find people, but and I think attending that historic homeowners fair is a great way, and we try and have a presence there every year if we have the time, and we meet people, and we end up with jobs 2 or 3 years later from somebody we've met at the fair, and they say, "Oh, you remember I saw you back in 2012." Okay, great. It's a repeat customers.
So, talking about your customers, what's a project that you're really proud of? What is it? Something that you can say, yes, this is what we were able to bring back to life.
Well, I would say one of the projects that I really enjoyed working on was the Stillwell House in Fort Sam Houston. Back in 2016, there was a serious hailstorm that impacted a lot of San Antonio, and it also had microburst, wind shear, and all kind of stuff like that. And the Stillwell House was built in 1889 out of stone, and it had wraparound porches on all sides. Well, the porch on the north side was caught by the wind, and the wind lifted it up, and the columns fell out, and it did a backflip, and it ended up upside down uh, on the deck of the
Yeah.
back of the house. And so we were asked to come out and look at that. And then I looked around and I noticed that there had been severe hail. And so I told them, y'all need to make a claim on your insurance. And we were able to, and it's run by Preservation Fort Sam Houston, a nonprofit organization. And they had insurance, and sure enough, the insurance adjuster came out, and I was able to get them around $475,000 to restore their roof and fix all the hail damage and the paint chips and everything that we noted around the building. And we took that roof structure apart board by board and salvaged 90% of the fabric of it, and we had to, mill some pieces and parts out of longleaf pine to match with the historic wood that was there, and rebuilt it. And it was just it was a learning experience for me. I mean, they really built good construction back then, and the way the building was built was incredible. I think just the later posts were not stable like the original construction was. It probably wouldn't have happened if it was the original. It lasted 120 years before that happened. So, uh,
How do you find that balance of good construction? Because you're going into a building that's typically 100+ years old, building your home, and you'll find that some updates happened, right? Some DIYer got in there. Eh, I imagine that makes the project more expensive in the long run when someone's gone in and tried to do it their way.
I'll give you a good example. There was a mid-century modern house, and it had a view of downtown San Antonio. It's an almost park area, and it had a terrace on the roof. And the terrace on the roof is an okay idea until some lady walks around with a high heel shoe or something and pokes a hole in the roof. And so the owner had constant leaks in the roof. So he decided to build an RV barn over his house to get the water over his roof. And we were asked to come out and look at the restoration of the house. And I consulted with my engineer, and he said, "Woody, you better take that roof off of there because, if you touch it, you're liable. And it's not anchored properly to the building, and a heavy wind could end up in a neighbor's yard or what have you." So there is a lot of that stuff where people say, "Oh, I'm going to fix it this way." And maybe it's not the best thing for the life of the building.
And water, we keep mentioning water, and in Texas, we don't see water often, but when we do, it comes down really hard with a lot of wind and hail. It's a weather event. But then we also have air conditioners now in a lot of these buildings, and people don't think about the leak. Water seems to be one of the most destructive things to these historic properties.
I would say it is. I have an expression, fire burns up, but water burns down. And if you take apart a wall that's burned, you'll see it gets wider and spreads as it goes up. And the water's the same way. It bounces off of this and that and spreads out through the building. And, a little leak at your roof can affect your foundation because it drips down through the walls and then ends up on the beams at the bottom. And then your building starts to sink because they're rotting from the bones
Yeah.
in. So water is extremely destructive, and air conditioning condensate leaks happen. And, my dad's house is a perfect example. I said, Dad, let's put your AC in a closet. And he said, no, I don't want to use that square footage for the AC. I want to put it up in the attic. And I said, please don't do that, Dad. Well, we did everything we were supposed to. We put in a pan with a float switch and a secondary drain and all that stuff. And I guess when they insulated the house, the insulator broke one of those drain pipes. And my dad had been in a house that was the housewarming party, and the ceiling went boop in the laundry room because there was a leak up there that we didn't know about. But, it's typical. It's just one little error in the system can cause a lot of damage.
And that's a call to homeowners in general, any age home. Understand where water is in your house. And air conditioners are just a great example. That pan underneath. I don't know that every homeowner, especially first-time home buyers, understand that liability and ultimately the impact.
Yeah.
It can be expensive to do that type of restoration.
And Moen has now come out with sensors that you charge up, and they're good for a year or whatever. And they have a little moisture meter, and we've got them in our cabin at the ranch, in the water heater closet where the pipes could freeze, or in the bathroom where leaks could happen, and underneath the kitchen sink. And so you strategically place them, and you can actually get a break from your insurance company for implementing those things. And they have some insurance companies have bargains on them that you can order through them and get a real good deal. And they're also water sensor systems where you can set a shutoff on your water meter as well. That's electronic.
Right.
And you can have wireless control. So say you're in Tahiti and it freezes in Texas, you could just shut your water off remotely. And that's just a great, and they can be interconnected where if they get a signal that there's a water leak, it shuts your water off. So the water is probably the most important thing to manage in a house and in the lifespan of a house, because it just affects everything.
I can think of a lot of property owners that during the big Texas freeze in 2021 would have really appreciated the ability to turn off the water. Because when it unfroze, we found every hole in every pipe very quickly.
Oh, yeah. And, it was unfortunate in that freeze that they were having such long brownouts and blackouts of the system because, you're like on a ranch property, your well pumps your water. Well, if you stop the electricity, then your well stops pumping, and then your pipes start freezing very quickly, especially when we're down to temperatures like 6 degrees, like we were in that freeze. So we had a client in the Sisterdale area who couldn't get to their house.
Yeah.
She was stationed in Saudi Arabia, I think, or Afghanistan, and her parents couldn't get to the house because it was up on a hill, and the pipe burst on the second floor, and the water flooded her second floor to her first floor and destroyed everything in between. And we had to complete gut the house down to the frame, and just for a freeze. And she was probably in the same deal. The power went off for a few hours, and the heater couldn't keep the house warm enough to keep the pipes from freezing.
Generac sold a lot of generators out of that event, and rightfully so. I think, especially when you talk about wells and infrastructure like that needs to move, it's a solid investment if you're out there in a situation like that.
My mom's 102 years old and living on the ranch. And when Bandera Electric Co-op came up with a program for the generators with low interest rate financing and all that, we said, sign us up.
Yeah.
And it has saved her from power outages a couple of times so far.
That's great to hear. And that is a lot of these homes. There are people, especially in the hill country, that are living in these homes well into 102 years old. And it comes with, you need some sense of security. You want your mom to be warm and safe when you're not able to get there. So generators all around. What happens in a situation like that when a historic home is flooded, is damaged to the point like wallpaper. How do you go back and find a wallpaper from 1910?
Well, a good example of that would be the LBJ house,
The
at
Texas
LBJ
White House.
Ranch. Yeah, the Texas White House. There's been extensive. They're doing a restoration of it right now, and I looked at the plans and specs, and there was probably 50 pages of specifications just on wallpaper. And there was conservators would go in and take samples of the wallpaper and research it and find out what was originally there and duplicate it. There are companies out there that can do custom printed
Remake it.
wallpaper. Yeah. But they're few and far between.
And I imagine that's not a discount
No,
place.
I don't think it's too bad, but it's probably a lot more than the run of the mill stuff.
It's time too. It's just going through the process of discovering it,
Yes.
recreating it, and then applying it, I guess. Looking at projects that you've done, what's a project you talk about your favorite projects and things like that, but what's something that people would see that people are in and out of that you're really proud of?
Well, I think it would have to be the Herf farmhouse restoration in Bernie. We first, when the Civil and Nature Center bought the farm, so to speak, and I think it was like 2007 or 8, the building was in deplorable condition. The windows had been broken out by kids. There was, piles of trash inside of the building, and it wasn't secure. And so the first thing we did is kind of on a pro bono basis, we helped the Nature Center with stabilizing the windows and restoring the windows. And then they went through a major structural restoration where they actually took down the collapsing walls, and we had to take the windows out and put them back in as they were rebuilding these masonry walls. That went from, the waist high to the gable 2 stories up. And that construction was just, on that building was so incredible. They had stone lintels above the windows and the wood trim, and you couldn't put a credit card between that trim and that piece of stone. And how they could carve that stone that smooth in 1860, it's beyond me. But that project was great. We really had to fight to get the interior restoration. Although my sister was the head of the Nature Center, she had a building committee, and they interviewed different contractors, and we fought to get the project. And it was a project that I got to work with my wife on as our first project together when we were just dating. So that's another thing a little bit special about it. But it involved all the trades and, sourcing of beadboard that matched what was there, and a lot of detail work to stone and plaster and finishes throughout the building, flooring. And it turned out great. And, people can go by and take a look at it. The Nature Center has the farmer's market every Saturday, and the house is usually open, and they do tours of the house. And it just turned out great. And, and it was my great-great-grandfather's house. And so that meant a lot to me to be able to preserve my family's homestead that was significant in Bernie's history.
It's such a beautiful building. I encourage anyone to go see it. The history that happened there with the Comanche history, the German settler history that came in with Dr. Ferdinand Herf, and everything that's led to now. I really appreciate that it's a place where my kids can see heritage, and they can see that construction you're talking about.
Yeah, they even have his old buggy that he rode around to treat people and make house calls with, which is incredible that thing survived in the barn for all those years, and covered up with leftover wood and everything else, and they could pull it out and restore it, and just like the rest of the house.
I sit there and try to imagine, what does a buggy ride from Alamo Heights to Bernie look like in 1860? And it's a treacherous path.
Me too. Yeah, I know you could stop at Leon Springs, I wasn't in there, but was that half the trip there to Leon Springs, and you spend the night, and then you take the other half from Leon Springs up to Bernie? I don't know, but I just imagine the one thing I always wondered is how they got the windows around Texas,
Yeah,
in a buggy, in a buggy.
safely.
And so we finally kind of figured out that the windows were made in divided lights, so they could stack up all the panes of glass and put them in a box, and then the windows would come in a kit kind of, and the pieces probably were wrapped up in burlap or something like that, and you would take them out and assemble them and then pop in the glass. And so that's how we figured that, there weren't large panes of glass in these old houses. They were all small panes so that they could ship them by wagon to the house.
Huh. I can't say I've ever thought about that, but I was thinking about the rock work in the same way. I mean, you talk about the precision of not being able to slide a credit card through, and that is something we do today with digital tools and scales. Were they cutting that stone on property?
Yeah, and that's, talk about sustainable construction and leads,
Yeah.
one of the things is that you use locally sourced material. Well, we were taking a break from working on the house, and we went over to sit by the Cibolo Creek, and I looked down and I saw the drill marks where they had actually quarried the stone out of the side of the creek 120 yards from the house. So that stone only had to come off of that hillside and be put on a wagon and go 100, 200 feet to the house, and then could be chiseled in place. So, the energy use of moving that, they weren't importing it by train from San Antonio or, Sister Dale or something like that. It was just sourced right there. And a lot of the wood that was used on the property was cypress, which grew along the Cibolo. And so you can see that it was sustainable construction. And the window with its disassemblable parts was very interesting too, because if you had a mutton bar get broken by an Indian attack, you just take the window and it had two little pegs you would knock out and it would disassemble, and you could replace the broken mutton bar and put the glass back in. And today, if you have a cracked window and a pillow window, you'd have to get a whole new window.
Yeah.
You can't just replace the glass.
The ingenuity of, I'm building a house to protect from Indians, and then when it happens, I need to be able to replace the glass, and just the forethought. And then a call to the trades. I really want to remind the kids that watch that old craftsmanship is really still core to what we're doing. If you can go out and mill stone and mill wood and do some of this stuff, you're going to be a valuable asset on a team like yours, where that older way of doing construction really does pay off.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that you said that there's some vocational education going on, because when I was in high school, I had friends that went to the AC education and had a career doing air conditioning, made very good money. My friends that are plumbers are doing very well,
Yep.
and there's some of these trades that, people think it's easy just to go, build a robot or whatever. But these guys, they go out and fix your house. They make good money, and for a good reason, because there's not there, for a long time, there wasn't a lot of vocational education. And so we're short of tradespeople. We need young people to come out and be carpenters and plumbers and electricians and AC, all of that stuff. And it's a good way to avoid a college expense that could, take you years to pay off, when you can start making money straight out of high school and build a career from that. I do believe in education. I do believe in college for sure. And, but there's got to be other alternatives to working into business. And I think the trades are one of them.
If you want to be an entrepreneur, being a plumber and electrician is a great way to start. The market is already well defined. It's there, and there's demand. So you can come in as an electrician or a plumber and really find the business, because to your point, there's not enough of the trades out here, particularly in Texas. As we grow, there's a lot of need. A lot of people go into the new construction, but I want to call to somebody that really recognizes when they walk through the Herf farm, they say, wow, that's incredible. I want to know more about that. There's a career out there for you to learn more about that and to be really world-class in it.
Yeah, and I think it's imperative that our schools recognize this, and they offer vocational and other types of programs that were phased out for a while there, because we're going to be very short of craftsmen, and
already are.
And the costs of that construction are going to go up because of just the supply and demand. If there's a lot of demand and only a few guys doing it, they're going to charge a premium.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up our conversation, and I've learned so much through this, what is the call to action? How can people learn more about what Guy Chipman Construction is doing? But then your broader message around vocational trades and the need there is very helpful. Where would you send people for more information?
Definitely the Office of Historic Preservation for the city of San Antonio has a broad compilation of literature and resources for preservation. They have you can actually research your house and find out its genealogy and who lived there, and there's all kind of interesting uh, information available through the libraries in San Antonio and other and the Office of Historic Preservation can point you in that direction. I just did think it's important that people go out and do their research and check people's references and find it, ask to say, hey, what other historic project have you done like this? And for me, it was the Hurt Farm, just the volunteer work that we did at the Hurt Farm got us into the Whitty Museum and Atascosa County Courthouse and other historic preservation projects that were uh, im- important to formatting my career.
And courthouses are such an interesting thing. You mentioned there's a cult following to courthouses in the state of Texas. Like there's a big belief. And when Mason burned down, that was tragic. That they rebuilt it in such a beautiful way.
Yeah, there was, we did a lot of courthouse work when I worked for Fisher Heck Architects, and there were only a few contractors that would do that. And Stoddard was one of them, and a few that have gone out of business. Like MJ Boyle, he's retired, but and some that just didn't make it because working for a courthouse can be quite difficult and challenging, and you're dealing with the preservation requirements as well as architects and county commissioners and everything else. So it can have its challenges, but I think it's just important that people check into who they're hiring, check references, and make sure you get a good contractor that has experience in the right areas to restore a historic property or any other kind of property. You just need to make sure because it's sad, but there's a lot of guys out there that take advantage of customers, especially, I hate to say it, but air conditioning companies, a lot of times they'll come out and say, you need a whole new system. And you just could use a capacitor that's, a $28 part in a service call. And they're just, it's sad, but so do your homework, research who you're hiring, and check us out. It's Wood with Guy Chipman Construction.
Fantastic. Well, Wood, thank you for the way that you're rebuilding Texas and the impact that you're having on future vocational opportunities and really just the conversation in general around what Texas has been and where it's going. So thank you for joining us today.
I enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.